But 2 more days later, no change in Ethlied, and Eardwulf met the captains again, this time in a far less genial manner than he had before. King Edward was in Aylesbury. Osric had her men on the eastern part of the rampart when a retinue of horses, baggage trains wove over the landscape and, at the front, a king in all his imperium rode forth, surveying his empire. Lord God, Osric thought to herself, as she took some steps away from the parapet, he looks as if he owns the country already, and she promised herself that she was going to keep out of his way as much as possible. Osric had managed to avoid the Ethelflaed up until then, being a little in Miral's favour. Osric had been able to wangle 2 easier shifts for her men outside, and the weather was good, rather than the fetid air of Ethlied's chamber, his deathbed, Osric had considered, wryly. So she had seen nothing of the deterioration of the Lord of Mercen, and until 3 days later, and Osric was told by Miral that Eardwulf's orders were that she and her men would close guard Ethlied again, that night. But the matter with the guards would not drop, and that morning and Eardwulf had pulled together the captains again, this time from both lands. Osric surveyed the West Saxon commanders as Eardwulf told the men how it was going to be, and she was surprised and pleased that she remembered Godwin's friend, Heard, equally once quite underdeveloped and delicate, who was now tall and rangy, dark eyes under dark brows, listening to Eardwulf. For he now was a captain in Mercia, and he was switching his attention at intervals to look at both Godwin and Steeper. Those 2 Osric had found snivelling in Odder's stables after being given a tongue-lashing by Miral, who now Godwin outranked and under whom Heard served. Our watch shifts. It is the Mercen way, Eardwulf concluded. Next to Godwin, Steeper got to his feet, unfolding his arms and towered over Eardwulf. If Ethlied's man was intimidated, he did not show it, and listened silently as the captain of the Edward's Guard folded his arms and told him that it was the West Saxon way or he would go to the king. Finally, Eardwulf relented, but insisted that the Mercens follow their own style, and the commanders devised a pattern that would distribute each faction evenly throughout Aylesbury without getting in each other's way. And there was the matter of primacy, which Osric noted that Eardwulf had not broached, whose word held more weight, was significant, and it was clever of the upstart Shawl, now Lord Eardwulf, to defer discussion, for he cited the Lord Ethlied's condition as a reason to break the meeting. So it was Eardwulf that was outside Ethlied's door when Osric led her men into the odour-heavy air that made her want to vomit, in which Ethlied was lying. If it had been her, Osric would have insisted the Lord of Mercia had fresh air, and had mentioned it to Miral, who pointed out that many Mercens would see how close to death he really was and lose hope. Hope of what? Osric was about to find out, and she stood on guard that night watching Ethlied, who seemed to be a little brighter, and was asking Miral about the succession. It is the Witan who will decide the succession, Ethlied told Miral, and it was as if confiding in him when he said, "And, what do they speak of?" "The Witan?" Ethlied insisted, when Miral did not answer. "I know not, Lord," Miral admitted, apologetically, "I am not part of the Witan, but I hear many things." Ethlied waved his hand, as if to urge him to continue, and Doth pointed where she wanted her men to stand, and they stood in a horseshoe around their lord, which would best shroud their lord's speech to anyone who might be listening to outside. "They speak of your daughter marrying, so her husband can be the next Lord of Mercia," Miral confided, bowing close to Ethlied. Osric could smell the stink of shit as Ethlied moved, and she could not conceive how it was he was still managing to live. "No, she is yet too young, I may well recover." But that was all that Miral could manage, because the door opened and in marched Eardwulf, who put a hand on Elfkin and Elfrith's shoulders and pushed them apart. Behind him, Eadith followed him, and Eardwulf put a hand to her back, pushing him in Ethlied's direction, as much as to say, "This is your place, do not leave it." She looked pale and thin, and she took the seat beside Ethlied, refusing to look at him, but touched his upper arm with her hand, comfortingly. "You will come with me," Eardwulf told Osric, "all of you," he added, and Osric tried to catch Miral's eye, to try to insist that they were not to be taken, but he was already striding down their long, torchlit corridor to the armory as another Mercen guard took their place. They had no choice, and Osric beckoned her men to fall in, cursing her ill luck that they would have to go to Mercia's throne room. The Mercen lords would be there, of course, and Edward. And she turned to her men as they approached the inner doors and called them into line. The discussion was long and sinuous, a discussion which seemed to meander from point to point, without actually resolving much, and Osric was astonished that Edward was not in the chamber. Mercenaries only, she thought. Bergard wishes his son, Berg, to marry the Lady Elfwin, came a voice by her ear, and Osric moved her head slowly to see Miral's face. He smiled, but it was a weak smile, and he stood place by the rear door, retrieving a spear from an outgoing guard. To provide stability to Mercia, a husband of Mercen's stock, and that she will not be married to a lord from a different realm who might usurp the leadership of Mercia. How likely was that? Osric wanted to ask him, but she put the idea aside as she watched Eadwulf take up position before the lords. Behind him, however, the doors were thrust open and her guards immediately drew forward their spears. It was steeper, and behind him, striding in front, was King Edward. It had been nearly 6 months since Osric had seen, and slept with the King of Wessex, and to her, he seemed to have changed. He seemed taller, and his clothes were richer, his hair curled around his coronet and his robe of purple conveyed imperial power. Behind him paced his father-in-law Ethelelm, who stood, silently, beside the king, and could not have looked more different if he had tried, dressed in grey, thin, unprepossessing. Until he spoke. Ethelelm stood before the Mercen Witan, whose lords were restrained by the point of Steeper's sword, and accused Eadwulf of ingratiating himself in Lord Ethelred's favour. Challenged by the richest man in Wessex, and undoubtedly the power behind Edward's throne, Eadwulf did not flinch, and indeed went on to tell the Witan of the discussion he had had with Ethelred. "My lord," he simpered, "has indeed let it be known that he had approved the proposed match of myself with," and at this, he paused, then nodded his head subserviently to Edward, "the Lady Elfwin." He rolled them. "Ally." Osric wanted to call out, and she felt Miral's hand steady her shoulder and instead, forced her teeth closed, lest she betray herself with her rebuttal. But it would hardly have mattered, for the lords were already talking loudly over one another, beseeching one another to speak for them and their cause. Bergard, of course, Osric now knew, had a vested interest in Eadwulf's claim to be false, but Elfwin was older than Bergard, who was, as he had told her, 16. Besides, who was the ruler beneath him, for a 16-year-old could not command a kingdom alone, even married to Alfred's granddaughter. And that took Osric's thoughts back to Ethelfled. She was not present at the Witan, though at Aylesbury, so where was Elfwin? Was she here too? Or had her mother secreted her away somewhere so that she could not be used as a pawn? It was what Osric would have done. And her thoughts ran on ... Ethelfled would not have done this alone, be able to hide hers and Ethelred's daughter to greatest effect ... Who would be beside her to carry out her every command? The shite that was her brother. As the guard changed, for the Witan seemed bedded in for the night when Miral called Osric's attention to gather her men, he dismissed them for the night and called Osric to the guard room. 88,888,888. "I need you on close guard as soon as you are able," Miral told her, after handing her a dish containing cured lamb and bread, and a jar of goat's milk, the latter nearly making her retch, such was the intensity of the odour. She drank it, in any case, for there might not be another opportunity to eat, if it turned out that Miral wanted her for something else that night. But he seemed to wish to talk, and he sat, genially, as she ate, eating a plate of his own, while watching her eat her food at speed. When she had finished, Miral stacked his plate on hers, before crossing to the guardroom door, and closing it behind him. "My men think you are here to be given special orders," Miral told her. "They think, because I have made them think, that the Lord Ethelred is in a critical condition, and that he may die at any moment. Arrangements are being made for his funeral," he added, looking carefully at Osric, "all of which are true," he conceded. Osric waited for him to continue, and he held her gaze for a moment. "I asked you to tell me about the guards," Miral asked her, "and how they are feeling in the current ... climate." "The guards are good, loyal," Osric told Miral, "they are following orders, your orders, Eadwulf's orders, with no complaint." She hesitated. It couldn't be helped. Images of what she had witnessed Elfrith doing with a bag of silver as she called up the stairs of the stable above room flitted into her mind. She nodded, admitting silently that there was more, and lowered her voice. "They talk of independence," Osrith said, getting to her feet. It was uncomfortable sitting down, and the goat's milk was doing nothing for her digestion. "They talk of rebellion against Wessex. I believe that money is being raised to the cause." Osrith felt her mouth fall open as Miral as good as read her thoughts. "Yes, I know," he told her, wearing a look of someone who was not surprised with what he had heard. "I suspected a rebellion, but towards independence," he murmured, as Osrith folded her arms around her. "We are independent as we are. Wessex does not rule here. And yet it may," Osrith thought. "If Edward brings in a man to marry Elfwin, a West Saxon whom he, or rather, Ethelelm, can control. In fact, had not Ethelelm sons of his own? He was covetous enough over the Wessex crown. Many attempts, Osrith was given to understand, from Elfrith, who else, had been made in the past to locate Edward's first son, Aethelstan, with, presumably, one intent, which was to eliminate him and leave the way clear for Etheld, Ethelelm's own grandson. "What would you have me do?" Osrith asked Miral. It was Elfrith who was collecting coin, she added. Miral likely knew this, yet Osrith felt duty-bound to tell him anyway. "Nothing, yet. Elfrith's wife's death hit him hard. If he feels he has something to live for, a cause, then this may occupy his mind." And Osrith thought about him and Elfrith, comforting one another, over Elfrith's wife, over Miral's love, for she had suspected the man loved other men and that one may have met his end at Tenhelg. But they would need a leader, someone who could stand firm against the Norse and Danes. There was no man of fighting age, even if Elfwin was left out of it all. It was then, the idea crept over her, but had yet to take root in her mind, or yield the fruit of a name. An idea so dreadfully savage to her own mind that she hardly dared think it. Yet a part of her brain had come up with it, and it made true, good sense. It made the only sense. "Remember, you are of Alba," Osrith told herself, sharply. "You are here not to fight for Wessex, or Mercia, or a king or a lord, but to bring intelligence back to Constantine and bring herself back," and Osrith's stomach lurched as she reminded herself that this would be sooner than she thought. "Tell me," Miral asked Osrith, as he paced too, placing a hand to his chin as he considered what she had told him. "Is the call, can you discern, from the men, for more than grudging obedience to Mercia?" And here Osrith knew his true meaning, rebellion. He wanted peace, Osrith knew, but in an independent Mercia. Miral was for Mercia, not unity. "They are proud Mersons, you saw that when we met both times to discuss procedure." "They know they are not West Saxons," Miral replied, chuckling softly, then looked back to Osrith. "They will follow orders of a captain, if necessary. A West Saxon one, if they must. But they do not begrudge their land, as you did not begrudge your land," she added. Miral looked at her suddenly, for she had reminded him of the time he had lived a sour life, in exile from his homeland, in the service of the Lord Odda. But, instead, he smiled, and placed an arm on Osrith's shoulder. "Good, good," Miral replied, then added, "Continue to be within listening distance of Eadwulf when you can. I will get you close guard as often as I am able, for he will surely come undone with his scheming. I do not trust him," Miral added, laconically. "And his sister? Eadith?" Osrith asked. "She lies with the Lord Ethliad," Miral replied, simply. They were shamed, like my family, their father bankrupted them. They wished to gain favor. Eadwulf pushed Eadith into Ethliad's path, and she became his mistress, and... But Osrith heard nothing more, for a violent cramp came to her stomach, and she threw up all over the floor between them. Another bout, and Osrith staggered back to the bench. "The goat's milk, I think," Osrith told him, as another wrench came, though she was dry-heaving now. "I will," she gestured towards her vomit, "clean it up, when I can." "Perhaps not the goat's milk," Miral replied, and Osrith noticed he had taken several steps back. Osrith placed a hand onto the table and pushed herself up, before flopping back down. Water, boiled, and then cooled, would be just the thing, Osrith thought, longingly, and she brought her hand to her stomach. Not sickness, or at least, I hope not, Osrith furthered, and felt a smile creep to her lips. She had been in Aylesbury for nearly a fortnight now, and had managed for many days not to even think about her real reason there. There is another reason I came to Aylesbury, Miral, she confessed. For safety. For sanctuary. And Osrith put hand to her stomach. The look on Miral's face was priceless. He opened his mouth a few times, as if about to say something, and closed it. Eventually, he leaned towards her. How when? He stammered. Osrith, what are you telling me? That I am with child, she replied, simply, and the usually brusque commander opened his mouth to say something else, then closed it again. I am quite well, all is fine. And unless I cannot move, I will still be doing my job, she told him. If that is acceptable to you. I can spare no men to protect you, Miral cautioned, and then looked back at Osrith again, as if waiting for her to tell him she was joking. The woman was into her 40s, pregnancy taxed women half her age. I ask for none, Osrith declared, and then felt astonishment flood through her when Miral stepped past her sick and sat on the bench beside her again. I succeeded at Tenhulg. I can help you when the time is right, he told her, not me, he added, when Osrith smirked. But, I know people who can help you. You will be quite safe and well here, he reassured her. In a leadership crisis? In the midst of an independence rebellion? Well, apart from that, Miral chuckled. I knew that, Osrith replied, which is why I returned to Mercia. Though I won't be stopping, she told herself, make no allowances for me, I do not want to be a burden to my men. Miral nodded, then asked her something else. If you were a mercen, what would you do? What is the best outcome for my country? That the Lord Ethliard did not die outright at Tenhulg, Osrith admitted, and conceded a sip of ale from Miral's jar. It is a pity someone has not put him out of his misery in the interests of Mercia. She put the ale down. His lingering is causing too many problems, too many divisions. We only need an attack of Danes in Mercia on top of all that and the kingdom could fall again. It took many moments for Osrith to realize Miral had not answered her. Instead, he stared at her with a long look. Osrith's heart sank. No. She protested, holding up her hands. I am no assassin, Miral. Poor old Helm had to promise to do it last time. It's different in battle. I am not asking you to, Miral reassured her, then reached for her elbow and escorted her from the room, turning to the young guard outside and ordering him to clear up the floor. He was just this side of being caught in a fight with a little West Saxon shit, Miral explained, jabbing a finger in the direction of the kitchens. Get a bucket and water, idiot. He yelled, when the boy reappeared at the door, looking confused. The kitchens. Walk with me, Miral encouraged, heading towards the stable yard. I need to check my horse had been mucked out, and you need to check on yours, he added, unnecessarily. Osrith picked up Miral's pace, nodding to Steeper and Godwin, who were inspecting the West Saxons, who were not on duty, and were organizing their men to practice sword skill. When they got to the door, Miral pushed it open, and Osrith trod onto the newly laid straw. Good job, she thought, nodding approvingly, before Miral closed the door behind her. Is your child's father the King of Wessex? Miral's question was uttered almost too quiet for her to hear, and as blunt as a rock. It was Osrith's turn to open her mouth and unable to say anything. Absolutely not, Osrith declared. That man is gone from me, she added, feeling the weight of her situation press again on her shoulders. Then, she saw Miral exhale with relief, before crossing to his beast, taking up a bristle brush and smooth his already smoothed coat, and Osrith guessed his thoughts. No bastard to confuse things. No second one, anyway. See, here, Miral said, pointing to something on the coat of the patient horse, who had closed his eyes just before, enjoying his grooming. Osrith looked, and could see nothing. Here, he told her, and when Osrith bent her head to the horse's warm abdomen, heard Miral say, "We have many ready to make a stand. In Gloucester, Tamworth, Oxford. Yes, even some over in the Danelaw, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby. We will not be usurped by West Saxons." Osrith turned her head to Miral, and looked into his eyes. He was deadly serious. "Elfrith?" she asked. Miral nodded. "Most of the guard. Which is why I was so grateful that Eadwulf insisted on the highest discipline. We would have been discovered otherwise. Some of the keenest are also some of the stupidest, and fighting the West Saxons when they argued with them was the best way to be." "What is the plan?" Osrith asked. "To find a lord to take Ethelred's place? We have someone in mind, someone that one of us has been keeping safe. But first, Osrith Lackland, do you swear to Mercia?" Osrith found herself nodding. Seizing his hand holding the brush, Osrith bowed her head to it. "It is good to hear that, Captain," came a voice from behind her. Osrith turned, and from the back of the stables strode a familiar face. She ran to him, a cry escaping her throat as she grabbed the reserved, stilted lord to her, feeling dampness beneath her eyes. "But how? Why?" Osrith questioned, then pulled herself towards Aldhelm again. "Are you a ghost?" Aldhelm laughed, faintly, and then took Osrith's forearms with his hands and eased her away from her. He was smiling. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to see you," he whispered, a smile on his usually dour face. Then Osrith turned to Miral, then back to Aldhelm. "I saw you fall," she cried. "You fell. A sword mangled your head." "Not me," Aldhelm admitted. "My brother," he sighed, "poor, dear Aldwin, fighting in Ethelflaed's faction. We were twins." He lowered his gaze to the floor. "It pains me much to remember that great and terrible battle." Then, Osrith turned back to Miral. "You wish Lord Aldhelm to assassinate Ethelred?" she asked of him, but Miral shook his head, his chestnut brown hair swinging about him. "Ethelred will die imminently. Aye." But Aldhelm turned to Osrith and took her hands, interrupting Miral, again. "You may not remember, but I asked you a question once," Aldhelm said, still holding Osrith's hands. "I asked you whether, if you had to choose, you would follow the Lord Ethelred or the Lady Ethelflaed," he continued, and Osrith could see exactly where this was going. She remembered him asking her shortly before she had turned north, in error and ended up at Dunham, nearly fleeing then to the Scots when they had arrived at the border of Burnishire and Pitland. "I remember," Osrith replied. "I remember well. Then, sworn to Mercia as you are, I took your advice." Aldhelm let go her hands and crossed to Miral's horse, slipping a small, folded parchment into a tiny opening in the horse's rein. From the outside, the skillful work had meant that to her eye, the making of it was invisible, and she wondered what was written upon it. "It is to your choice," Aldhelm told Osrith, then lighted up as brilliant as Osrith had never seen him before. "For months, years now, we knew we had no hope if Ethelred died with no heir, and could see no more way of pressing our cause if there was no strong leadership in our land. It was you who made us see. She is a strong, brave warrior, she had the love of the people, and while she is West Saxon, she is also Mercia. She might have known. The bloody, conniving, narcissistic, beloved Lady of Mercia, now ingratiated into a plot to make her ruler." But, as she said this to Aldhelm, he shook his head. "We have not included her directly. Of course we have not. But, your words made us realize, Osrith, that if we were going to survive as a nation, we would need a strong leader." "Not Eadwulf?" Osrith asked, still looking over Aldhelm as if still expecting to wake up from a dream. But his warm breath near her neck made Osrith realize this was, unfortunately, genuine. "No," Aldhelm shook his head. "Where she goes I go. I have been shadowing her since to Tenhulg. And she must be protected at all costs." "Oh, she will be loving that," Osrith thought, dully. "I suppose my brother is with her?" she asked, trying not to sound like someone with a problem. "Your brother?" Old Helm looked at Osrith confused. "Did you not hear the argument, on that day on the battlefield?" Miral supplied. "Christ, the Irish could have heard it in Dublin, how loud it was." But Old Helm shook his head. "I had gone into hiding by then." He turned his eyes to Osrith. "My brother," Osrith reiterated, firmly. "And, though you will not like it," she furthered, "because, if she didn't, someone would, and it might as well be these loyal rebels of Mercia with whom she threw in her lot. I would proposing him for the throne of Mercia, for he is cousin to the Lord Ethelred." She watched as Old Helm's eyes widened. But it was Miral who looked, narrow-eyed to her. "Uhtred," Osrith said at last, when two of her friends had come up with a blank. "Uhtred of Bibbenberg." "My brother."